Good morning, fam of Liberty. I'm admin Tim. I'm the founder of the page. And today I'm going to be doing a video addressing a lot of the comments that we tend to get each year during the Confederate Heritage Month videos that we post. It's worth noting that this video is not primarily for page fans. It's for people in the comments. Every year, Sons of Liberty does this performative bit for Confederate Heritage Month. And inevitably, there are triggered MAGA conservative snowflakes in the comments, shitposting their inchoate rage at our mockery of their dead traitor ancestors and our glorification of Southerners who remain loyal to the United States. The vast majority of their attempted enshittification ends up being a variation on 2 or 3 common themes. So here are some of the gems and my personal rebuttals to each. But before I do, it's worth pointing out that I wouldn't have to make this video if conservatives weren't so triggered to engage in cancel culture and erasing history by trying to whitewash history. The same people crying about their participation trophies and their participation statues are the same people who vote for and encourage policies and laws to remove books from schools, to whitewash the reasons for the Civil War, to suppress anything that doesn't meet their agenda. I'm just not having it anymore. So without further ado, here we go. You don't know shit about history. I do, in fact. I'm a Gen Xer nerd who reads at least 1 book a month, depending on how much I have to work, or shitpost videos or respond to stupid comments. What I also am is a dedicated troll, and you dipshits fall for it every year. I've been studying this subject for years, in an effort to know what to say and to disarm or nullify your stupid fucking talking points. You must hate Southerners or you must be a Yankee. 5 of 6 current page admins are from the South. We have admins in Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, and Florida. We don't consider ourselves anything but Americans. The fact that you associate us as not like you is the whole fucking problem. Your values are alien to us. You worship your dead traitor ancestors. We don't. My great-great-great-grandfather was the Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederacy and was the inspiration for Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind. I have ancestors who were slave-owning oligarchs and whose estates and wealth were confiscated by the Union. I also have ancestors who were abolitionists and fought on the right side of the conflict. Always fun to hear from a pussy who would have absolutely shit himself making fun of dead soldiers and other variations of keyboard warrior or whatever. That's cute. I was a professional soldier for 10 years and a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. Interestingly, this guy didn't get banned by Facebook for this, but when I replied with something like, always ironic being called a pussy when you've been following long enough to know I'm a vet, I instantly got banned by Facebook. I'm just pointing that out because conservatives spent 4 years of Trump's administration claiming that social media was censoring them. Meanwhile, I've been called homophobic slurs, ethnocentric slurs, and a whole bunch of other things, not to mention literal actual death threats. And those accounts are all still there. Why do you dress up as General Sherman? You know what he did after the war. Yeah, I know. And the page acknowledges that Sherman is a real bastard. His only saving grace through the eyes of modern history is to have torched Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Don't talk to me about war crimes until you confront the evils of the Fort Pillow Massacre, or the Battle of Poison Springs, or the Battle of the Nueces, or countless others where Confederates murdered enemy soldiers and mutilated their dead bodies. As for why I do Confederate Heritage Month posts in cosplay, it's because I think it's funny. I think it's severely triggering to neo-Confederate bootlickers who simp the heritage not hate bullshit. It's apparently highly entertaining to everyone else, judging by the Sons of Liberty page engagements and TikTok video counts, to say nothing of the comment sections. Now let's talk about the other comments, the ones that actually deal with history. States had a constitutional right to secede. Okay, hotshot, show me where in the Constitution does a state have the right to secede. Don't worry, I'll wait. Oh, and while you're over there frantically Googling it, let me just tell you what constitutional scholars and the United States Supreme Court have already said. The Constitution makes no provision for secession. A government is not a corporation whose existence is limited by a fixed period of time, nor does it provide for a means of its own dissolution. The Constitution of the United States provides that it may be amended, but it does not, as it exists now, contemplate its own destruction, nor a dissolution of the government of which it is the living evidence. Constitutionally, there can be no such thing as secession of a state from the Union. Now let's start with the preamble of the Constitution. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, etc., etc. We have a perfect union. You can't dissolve a perfect union. There's also James Madison, he wrote the Constitution, stating explicitly that a unilateral secession is unconstitutional. There's also Supreme Court cases that use the principle that our Constitution is perpetual as early as 1787. But please, feel free to cite the exact clauses and subparagraphs within the Constitution where it says so. Don't worry, I'll wait. And whilst you're over there typing all the 1950s propaganda that you learned, like I did in Charleston, South Carolina school system, I've got more heartbreaking news for you. The war wasn't actually about slavery. Whenever we get dumb comments like this, or the ones that are about whether or not these guys were traitors, which we'll deal with later, I choose not to believe the Confederate apologists of today. I choose to believe the secessionists and the loyalists of the 1860s. As an example, the autobiography Rebel Private, Front and Rear by William Andrew Fletcher acknowledges that the Yankees were invading the South to quell rebellion and to free enslaved black people. Fletcher's book is one of the most critically examined books of the era, particularly because he was a common enlisted private of little means, and there are incredibly few books written by Confederate enlisted men. Fletcher acknowledged that his father wanted to move the family to Mexico to keep his sons out of the coming war. Father and son knew that the war would doom the South and that there was virtually no hope for victory. Fletcher chose to fight because his state had become part of the Confederacy, and he figured that it was his duty. It's also worth noting that Fletcher does not seem to exude any prejudice towards race, ethnicity, religion, culture, or social status. But Fletcher and his father definitely knew what the war was about and why there was fighting. Legendary Confederate partisan leader John Mosby, of Mosby's Raiders notoriety, wrote to a former colleague of his and said, and I quote, "I notice that Kane says the charge that the South went to war for slavery is a slanderous accusation. I always understood that we went to war on account of the thing we quarreled with the North about. I never heard of any other cause of quarrel than slavery." It's also worth noting that Mosby had little interest in war monuments, writing that they were both a waste of time and money if they served to inflame hatred. Of the 7 states which originally formed the Confederacy, at least 5 attributed the cause of secession to slavery as its primary position. In fact, if you compile these 5 states, just these 5 states alone, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, Virginia, and South Carolina, the word slavery appears 39 times, and the word slave or slaves appears 85. These articles of secession are public documents. The state of South Carolina, for example, has its articles in the state capitol building and the copies available online. Of the remaining 4 states that later joined the Confederacy, a further 2 directly attribute slavery as the reason for secession. Almost all of the states wrote indelible and explicitly clear statements such as the subordination and the political and social inequality of the African race was fully conceded by all, and our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, and because of increasing hostility to the institution of slavery. At the very onset, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina declared that President-elect Abraham Lincoln's opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. December 1860, some 3 months before Lincoln would even be inaugurated. 7 states seceded before Lincoln was sworn in. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee would secede later that year. Missouri and Kentucky would draft articles of secession in October and November of 1861, respectively. On that note, just to highlight how severely ass-mad Confederates were, in 1861, Lincoln made it abundantly clear that he intended to take no actions that might even threaten the institution of slavery in the South. A quote from Lincoln, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I add, too, that all the protection which, consistently within the Constitution and the laws, can be given will be cheerfully given to all the states when lawfully demanded for whatever cause." The Articles of Secession, in several cases, elaborate that the federal government wasn't honoring the Constitution and was allowing northern free states to avoid enforcing or outright ignoring the Fugitive Slave Acts. These traitors complained that a stronger, more central federal government was needed in order to impose their slave laws on other states. They were also severely ass-mad that no other slave states would be admitted to the Union, and the United States was diligently pursuing manifest destiny, that is, making the United States extend from coast to coast. John C. Breckinridge, a former U.S. vice president, originally from Kentucky, ran against Lincoln as the candidate for the South. He ran on an explicitly pro-slavery platform. When he lost, he briefly returned to the U.S. Senate during secession and then volunteered for the Confederate Army. Publicly branded a traitor, he was expelled from the Senate. During the final years of the Confederacy, he was appointed Confederate Secretary of War. Fearing being hung for treason, when the war was over, he fled the country and lived abroad for a few years in self-exile. He only came home when President Johnson extended amnesty to Confederate traitors. Vice President of the Confederacy Alexander Stephens made a highly publicized speech called the Cornerstone Speech, so named because A, the great truth or cornerstone upon which secession and confederation was based was white supremacy and black subordination. He mentioned slavery and supremacy a number of times, going on to say, this was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. He explicitly stated in no uncertain terms that the Confederacy was founded on the notion that slavery is the natural condition for black people. Our Confederacy is founded upon principles in strict conformity with these laws. The president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, stated that a revolution would be started if the right to slavery was denied. Shortly after South Carolina seceded from the Union, Kentucky Senator John Crittenden, in an effort to preserve the integrity of the Union and keep states from seceding, proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would have recognized permanently the right of any state to practice slavery. Crittenden's proposed constitutional amendment failed to receive sufficient support in Congress. The right of property in Negro slaves was formally enshrined in the Confederate Constitution itself. Not only did the word slave and the word Negro openly appear frequently, the document explicitly recognized and preserved as inviolate the right of race-based slavery in the new nation. 6 of the seceding states rewrote their constitutions, and the only major change was recognizing slavery. Sure, other traitors took up other causes to fight, so it wasn't only about slavery, but that was the primary reason, and almost everything else was tied to that, directly or indirectly. Economics, tied to slavery. States' rights, the right of an individual slave-holding state to ignore the government and own slaves. Westward expansion, because new states would join that did not or could not allow ownership of slaves. Example, Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, thereby tipping the precarious balance of power between the slave-owning South and the largely industrialized North. Defense of one's own home state? There wouldn't be a need to defend one's home state had they not seceded and started a war over slavery.
The war was about states' rights. A state's right to what? That's literally the only necessary comeback. So leave a comment if you get any coherent responses whenever you ask that. What I usually get is either radio silence or something like the very clearly anonymous person whose name and profile picture I've carefully redacted and did not, in fact, draw dick pics on. And now, a dramatic reading of his response.
Fuck you. You're a bullshit artist and don't deserve any answers because you're a damn lying asshole.
This sensitive snowflake was so triggered by being confronted by a question from Captain Obvious, that's me, that he had absolutely no way of expressing all those big feelings other than shitting all over the thread. Honorable mention goes to this other guy who was so triggered that he wrote a fucking wizard's tome on not just this post, but several others. And he followed it up with a rebel flag and I'm a combat vet. Like that's going to stop me from verbally pushing his shit in. Nah, bro, I don't give a fuck if you're a veteran. Our tribe is so full of people from all walks of life, including cosplatriots who wave a rebel flag but tell everyone that they're the gatekeepers of patriotism. Fuck that bullshit. I'm a combat veteran, and I'm not entitled to any more respect because of it. Which certainly means that you sure as fuck aren't entitled to it from me.
If they were really traitors, then why was nobody ever tried for treason? Few were tried for treason because of the massive body count that depopulated both sides. Also, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Unionist who used to be a slave owner, was a pussy who was bought out by Southern money. But we also acknowledge that executing high-ranked Confederate officers and politicians for treason probably would have made the tensions between North and South, which linger to this day, even worse. But considering the war was won and the South's manpower had been incredibly depleted, I think they could have managed. Ample historical evidence exists that plenty of people who weren't the final decision maker wanted to try every single one of them for treason. Sadly, they were overruled. As an example, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wanted to try as many Confederate officers and politicians as possible. President Johnson tried to sack Stanton, and Congress impeached Johnson, reinstated Stanton, and decided to treat Johnson like an enemy for the remainder of his time in office. They were loyal to their state first. We acknowledge that conflicting loyalties was one of the most visible matters during the Slavers' Rebellion. Regional sentiment was a thing for some people, but given the amount of Southerners who remained loyal to the oaths that they swore to the United States, so on that note, let's talk about common perception of loyal Unionists at the time. Admiral Franklin Buchanan of Maryland was the first commandant of the U.S. Naval Academy. He resigned his commission April 22, 1861, expecting his home state to secede. When it didn't, he tried to rescind his resignation. U.S. Secretary of Navy Gideon Welles outright refused, saying he did not want traitors or half-hearted patriots in his Navy and refused to reinstate him. Buchanan fled to the Confederacy 5 months later. Samuel Phillips Lee, a Union officer and cousin of notorious traitor Robert E. Lee, was interrogated about his loyalty and famously replied, "When I find the word Virginia in my commission, I will join the Confederacy." Countless other officers who were suspected of pro-Southern sympathies wrote very impassioned letters to their superiors offering to re-swear their oaths of loyalty, many of them decrying rebel traitors and disloyal snakes. A respected businessman from New York City wrote, "There is a good deal of talk amongst the intelligent men of the community on what should be done with Army and Navy officers who resign. The general sentiment is that they should all be put under arrest. I am confident that course would be applauded by the public. I believe it is the current course." The U.S. Navy chose to censor the Secretary of the Navy, Isaac Toucey, who had been accepting resignations in 1860 without inquiring as to why. His replacement was Gideon Welles, who, instead of accepting resignation, decided to summarily dismiss many of the 400 naval and marine officers who resigned. Some names were stricken from the Navy's records, which was a more severe step, and many were dismissed with the resounding phrase, "by order of the President." This last one is the most severe, as it was final, ultimate, and could not be revoked, not even through an appeal of court-martial. Several officers were charged with conspiracy to commit sedition when it was learned that they had tendered resignation, and before waiting to see if that resignation was accepted, almost immediately tried turning over federal installation to rebels. There are literally hundreds of examples of all of this, so I'll leave it at that and move on to the next brain-dead, dumb, fuckistan bullshit. The war wouldn't have happened if the North hadn't invaded the South. Again, the Constitution not only doesn't provide a right to secede, but it also makes clear what happens to fucking traitors. And I quote, "Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them." Article 3, Section 3, Clause 1.2. You can't invade your own country. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina on April 12, 1861. The North did not send combat troops across the Potomac into the Confederacy until mid-July, some 3 months later, at the first Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. In the words of the immortal sage Lil Jon, "Don't start no shit, it won't be no shit." Lincoln invaded the South and unconditionally invading a foreign sovereign nation, yada yada. There are a sum total of 0 nations on earth, past or present, which recognized then or recognize now that the Confederacy was a nation. In fact, when they seceded, Lincoln merely declared them to be states of insurrection. You can't invade something that you already own. The Constitution makes it abundantly clear that war will be levied upon insurrectionists, something the MAGA crowd should have fucking figured out prior to January 6th. Because the Confederacy was never recognized as a legitimate nation, it is for that reason that when I mention Robert E. Lee or other traitors who tendered resignation from the U.S. military, I refer to them by the final rank that they held in the Union Army, such as Colonel Robert E. Lee. Lee was never a general of a lawful combatant army. The Southern slave owners were Democrats. I agree with you 100%. The Southern slave owners were religious, conservative capitalists. Today, we call them Republicans. Democrats also passed the Civil Rights Act, the same Civil Rights Act that today's Republicans are trying to destroy. Democrats aren't the ones losing their shit when Civil War participation trophies to conservative slave owners get taken down. So, yeah, let's use the same labels that you use. Answer me this question. Why are Republicans trying so hard to keep monuments for slaveholders and KKK icons today? Don't worry, I'll wait. Whilst you're trying to think of a suitable comeback, think about this. What party does David Duke, Grand Wizard of the KKK, support? Here's a hint. Duke has been a Republican, including an elected Republican politician for decades, and is self-identified as right-wing, since he was 14 years old. So it ain't the Democrats, that's for goddamn sure. All the people waving Confederate flags, who do they vote for? Here's a hint. It's not Democrats. All the people who are closeted or openly neo-Nazis or members of the KKK, who do they vote for? Again, don't worry, I'll wait. In those days, Republicans were often called the radical Republicans as a pejorative from Southern conservative Democrats, but also embraced by progressives, liberal Republicans, abolitionists. Republicans believed that the government should clear the way for those at the bottom of the economy, making sure that they had access to resources, education, and the internal improvements that would enable them to better themselves. They believed in higher education. They welcomed immigrants. They believed that the federal government had power to override state laws that enforced inequality among different Americans. They created the Department of Justice to ensure that all American citizens enjoyed the equal protection of the laws. So when you make stupid, uninformed statements like, slavery and KKK was created by Democrats, you identify yourself as a fucking moron who unthinkingly parrots gibberish and doesn't grasp the keen irony that not only are the Democrats from that era religious conservatives who today would be called Republicans, but you also completely miss the reality that today's Republican Party is a projection of the ideology of the Republican Party in all of its phases. Rather than either an active government that defends equal rights and opportunity or a small government that protects property and relies on market forces, which Republicans stood for as recently as 8, 9, 10 years ago, today's Republicans advocate a strong government that imposes religious rules on society. It has completely disavowed progress and enlightenment, the lower middle class, and everything that it stood for. So let's be real about it. Yeah, you're right. A lot of those men's were what could be called Southern Democrats, but just as 1860s Democrats are the complete opposite today of what they were then, so too are Republicans. And you're either an uneducated idiot or you're intentionally and willfully obtuse, which is even worse. I'm not easily offended, but your willful fucking stupidity on that subject is borderline insulting. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this video is informative for some people. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Again, for Sons of Liberty, I'm Admin Tim, and Admin Tim 316 says, get fucked and die mad about it. Hashtag not sorry, not sorry.